awful speaking to an empty piece of cement. Well, the grannies, as usual, gave us a really good introduction. I've been asked to speak about foreign policy, so in a nutshell, you have a dictatorship, the Harper dictatorship, which has no conception of what democracy is, but is very intent on taking its version of Cold War democracy and imposing it on everybody who already isn't under U.S. and Western imperialist dictate by force of arms or by whatever means necessary. And that's in essence the foreign policy of Canada. So, I mean, just to make a couple more points on that, with the Harper dictatorship, we are just seeing how far the prerogative powers, they used to call them, you know, the royal prerogative, or the executive powers, or the arbitrary powers of a government in a parliamentary democracy is, and how much the old notion of parliament in command can be smashed and has been smashed with the Harper government. And we can see the extent to which any semblance of a system in which the government, as the legal will, can be seen to reflect the popular will, the will of the people, has also been completely smashed. So the cartel party system that we have is the instrument to keep the people out of power, because its aim is to implement an antisocial agenda. It cannot discuss that agenda. It cannot have politics in the country which actually discuss that agenda and where people, public opinion is formed in that way. So instead, they've replaced it with sophisticated marketing systems. Whether or not they're legal, whether or not they follow the Canada Elections Act, it doesn't matter. They use micro-targeting, they use every kind of trick in the book to impose their power and their will on the people. And so you can't in any way suggest that this is a democracy. So this is what the Harper government is hell-bent on imposing on the rest of the world. It's carried out an electoral coup at home and claims it's going to bring democracy to everyone else, whether it's Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, Cuba, North Korea, and so on and so forth. All of those who don't come under the dictate of the US are called rogue states. Once you're a rogue, in exactly the same way that he says that if you don't uphold his values, which he calls Canadian values, then you don't deserve to have any rights and you can be targeted in Canada, and that's what's happening to people in Canada. In the same way, you're a rogue state. So everyone who doesn't follow under that dictate just simply becomes a rogue, and then you have no rights, and then you're subject to whatever force of arms the Harper dictatorship acting for US imperialism wants to carry out. And that's the foreign policy. So I want to just bring to people's attention some of the recent things which have taken place, most of which I'm sure you know about, but some of which you may not, just to bring to our minds the gravity of what's going on, the seriousness and the speed with which everything is being transformed, everything is being wrecked, you could say. So, I mean, the one that's most most recent is that on September 7th, the Harper government severed all its diplomatic ties with Iran, and all notion of, all diplomatic relations with Iran are finished, and all notion of Canada as a country which upholds the diplomatic norms and which is some kind of, as they have always claimed to be a factor for peace in the world or have a history of peacekeeping. I mean, all of that is just smashed once more. So at the same time as it did that, it declared that it's listing Iran as well as Syria as state sponsors of terrorism, according to powers contained in the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act. Now, the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act was one of the bills passed with this omnibus crime bill, which of course we were told was, to put pedophiles and rapists in jail. But let's see what it was really all about and who it really targets. Because by doing this, the Canadian courts can be used to sue the Iranian and Syrian governments, and their assets in Canada can be frozen, and they can be used as a judgment or for payment based on a judgment against Syria or Iran. The listing of a country as a state sponsor of terrorism is a completely arbitrary act. It does not have to go through Parliament. It's all done through regulations. It's another example of the absolute smashing of any notion of a parliamentary democracy in Canada. It's completely outside Parliament's control. So in this way, the pro-war, pro-torture, pro-Israel, pro-imperialist Harper government is now using the powers it gave itself in the Omnibus Crime Bill to embroil Canada in acts of war by outlawing countries. So our conclusion to this is that Canada needs an anti-war government. But more than this, severing of diplomatic relations with Iran would seem to be the answer from the U.S. imperialist war machine, which Canada has become an integral part of. It's an act which is profoundly damaging not only to Canadians' desire to contribute to peace in the world, but to Canada's history of multilateral and bilateral diplomacy. The claim of successive federal governments that Canada is a peace-loving country, friendly to all peoples in the world without discrimination, is simply not sustainable. It's replaced with a fierce battle to have Canada's anti-communist Cold War definition of human rights, democracy, and free market economics prevail, even if it means dragging the whole of humanity into a conflagration of global dimensions. So it shows us that Canada needs an anti-war government. Now we have to talk about warmongering against Syria. The Harper dictatorship has been playing a very, very big role in pushing for the UN to take a stand against its own founding principles of self-determination and non-interference in the affairs of other countries. So clearly the US and its allies are neither neutral nor are they concerned about the profound humanitarian crisis, which is of concern to all of us. They're not trying to empower the Syrian people. If this were the case, if they were truly concerned about democracy, why wouldn't they start in Canada? Why wouldn't they start here to renew the democracy? So instead of doing so, they're actively arming and organizing the agents within Syria and Turkey with the aim of filling the vacuum if the Syrian government has been overthrown, were to be overthrown. But it has not been overthrown. And so I think that people should pay very serious attention that they're preparing the conditions, they're trying again for another coalition of the willing. And we remember what happened in Iraq, with the coalition of the willing, and we are not going to stand by and let it happen again and have Canada embroiled in it. So Canada needs an anti-war government. Now, I can't stop without saying a word or two about what's going on in the Arctic, because recently they carried out war exercises called Operation Nanook, and a lot of the aspects of this deserve our close attention. The indications are that these exercises were under NORAD command, which means, in fact, they were under U.S. command, and this is what they call defensive sovereignty. Another important feature of them is that the military is more and more being integrated with civilian institutions. What that means, of course, is that the whole society is being militarized. So it's a very, very serious concern. Now, the Harper dictatorship's emphasis on the militarization of the Canada's Arctic, which includes recent reports of plans to establish a permanent NATO military base in Resolute Bay, Nunavut, underscores the urgency of Canadians to put an end to this Harper dictatorship. Plundering Canada's resources and establishing military bases to benefit the rich and guarantee the strategic interests of U.S. homeland security seems to be their main preoccupations, and they're doing all this with absolute contempt for the hereditary rights of the people on whose land they're doing this, the people, the Inuit people, the Aboriginal peoples of the North, and they have no business carrying on in this way, because it's up to the Aboriginal peoples themselves to determine what happens to the Arctic and not to hand it over to the U.S. militarists. So we denounce them for this, and we call on them And we call on everyone, you know, to step up the fight for an anti-war government. Finally, I want to point out one other very important thing which is not being discussed, and I'm sorry if I'm going on for so long, but there's so many things happening, and they're so important to discuss. Another very, very important thing is what's happening with the border. Now, one of the things that recently happened with almost no notice, you know, because the press only likes to talk about who's topless and who's bottomless these days and all sorts of things that are of no bloody concern to people at all. And the things that really, you know, affect our lives profoundly are not even discussed. So this is the fact that we now have our airports with American, they have been handed over to the Americans. So the Americans are in the Canadian airports pre-screening who can travel to the US and who can. And you can just see where else this is going to go in the future. You know, that you won't even be able to travel over US airspace to go anywhere in the world unless the Americans have given you pre-clearance. And all of these assaults on our border, on our security, the very, very fast pace at which they are integrating the armed forces, the police, the security, and all kinds of apparatus without discussing it with anyone, without it going through Parliament. It's just all being done. And so it's a very, very profound assault on the right of Canadians to decide. So what is our conclusion on all this? And the thing I want to leave with you is that we need a political movement. Because how is it that Harper and Redford and Christy Clark and all these people can keep on getting elected when they don't represent the will of the people, when they don't represent they don't defend the rights of the people, they don't fight for the interests of the working class. As Granny's eloquently said in the beginning, they serve the rich, and they exist in these governments to pay the rich, to militarize the economy, to plunder the resources, and to stamp on anyone who gets in their way. So how do they get away with it? It's because we don't have the political movement to match the social movement, where we can ourselves elect those people who are responsible back to us, and who will go and fight for the program which the people represent and defend that in the Parliament and everywhere else. So it's building that political movement is crucial. And part of that, of course, is that Canada needs an anti-war government. Thank you very much.